I'm Marco Werman, and this is not PRI's The World. This is news on KRLX 88.1.
Welcome to KRLX. We're happy to have you here.
Thanks, Katie. Great to be here.
So first, I'd like to start with a question for you about world music. I hear that term thrown around a lot, and I know that there's controversy about it to some extent. So, do you think it's helpful for us to have a category that we call world music, to have this label? Or do you think that that kind of homogenizes things, or throws everything together in the same bucket too much?
Yeah, boy, it's one that people in the people who perform so-called world music and those who kind of work in the domain have been like wrestling with for a while. I mean, the positive side is that when there were record stores, there was a section known as world music where you could go and you could expect to find musicians like Youssou N'Dour and oud players from the Middle East and Mercedes Sosa from Latin America. The people who want to find that music, they knew where to go to get it. The problem is people who are exponents of that kind of music feel it's condescending, that it ghettoizes that music. I mean, it goes back to like what Duke Ellington said about music. There are only two types of music, good music and bad music. And so we just want to hear good music. That's what I hear a lot of people who are in the world music arena, who play that kind of music, whatever that means, end up by saying. David Byrne wrote an article a few years ago in the New York Times called "Why I Hate World Music," and that's kind of rich coming from somebody who started this label Luwaka Bop, which is all about music that we don't understand the words to, that music that comes from a different place than the U.S. or the U.K. But basically, I mean, his kind of notion is that we live in a world where everything is kind of cross-fertilizing, and the internet pushes that, air travel pushes that. So how can we possibly kind of live with this notion of a genre called world music? It just seems kind of silly. You've got, a band like the Colombian band, I'm forgetting the name, Chokib Town. You take a band like Chokib Town from Colombia, which plays a really traditional type of music from southern Colombia, from the Putumayo region, from this really wet rainforest, and yet they're mixing hip-hop in, not because they want to be like, Jay-Z wannabes. They're just hearing it, and it's kind of coming into their culture, it's part of their world, and they incorporate into that what they already know. But, I also still feel strongly that it was a good thing initially to kind of give this music a label so people could find it, so it could get more traction in places like the United States where people don't really know that much about music from other countries. It was actually a group of 5 really committed devotees of international music who got together in 1986 in a pub in London and said, we need to give this music a name, because otherwise it's just all going to get shoved into the back of the store. They used to have like the international music like section, which was just everything from like field recordings of, I don't know, Margaret Mead and Pygmies singing to Angelique Kidjo or whoever is popular. But it's a tough one to balance. But I think we're kind of at the point. So that was 1986 when they invented the term. We're at a point now where I think it's not so applicable anymore. We don't have record stores. Genres and labels mean less and less. And you've got Jay-Z sampling Punjabi MC in India, Missy Elliott, sampling Egyptian music. So it's all kind of gotten thrown out the window, I think.
What kinds of musical movements are going on outside the United States that we're not hearing about?
There's a lot going on that we're not hearing about. I mean, there's a lot going on that I'm not hearing about, but there are. What are we hearing about that I don't know? There's a lot. The music scene. The music scene. My concern is that music scenes in other countries are being eclipsed by very highly produced commercial music, that some of which is coming here. A lot of it is not. There's a little Indian spice shop and food store up the street from where I live in Cambridge, and they've got a huge rack of CDs. But it's that kind of Bhangra hip hop sound. It sounds very samey. And my concern is that they're essentially copying an American and Anglo-American music model where it's easy to sell music that people know. People depend on a certain type of music and a certain type of sound, and they wait for it to come to them. So the scenes are becoming more and more homogenized, and that's a concern because I feel like the homogeneity is being pushed by companies and by making money off music. So anything that's different tends to be, oh, that doesn't quite fit with what we're trying to do.
And as far as the music and the ideas that you bring on your show, what have you been doing lately on the world?
Yeah, I mean specifically, we have been trying to focus more on the story behind certain artists. And I mean, it varies too, because we often try and squeeze in a music story into a set time block. So our editor will say, you've got a great interview, that will go there, but when it comes to just a piece of music and the ability to talk about it, well, we might be given like 2 minutes. You got to write a little copy, you've got to throw some music in. So somebody asked me earlier, what am I listening to? A Cuban musician named Pedrito Martinez, who's doing came out last year with a fantastic kind of Cuban rumba interpretation of flamenco music by Camarón de la Isla, great flamenco singer, great flamenco singer from Spain. This album by this Congolese singer Baloji, he lives in Belgium, but he has done a very respectful treatment of traditional Congolese, again, rumba, but with a kind of hip-hop, outspoken political edge to it, feeling very much like I am a Congolese, I'm a Belgian, I'm a dual nationality, I have the right to criticize both places and exalt both places. So I guess if there are trends happening, what I see happening is a much more, in terms of, if we're going to talk about world music in quotation marks, just a greater embrace of people's own roots and traditions while moving it into the future.
And what kinds of things do you see as being aspects that unite the musicians that you've met in countries around the world? I mean, you've talked about a homogenization, but there also must be differences, but as well as this sort of similarity that unites the depth of performance as well as just the industries.
I think the common thread is that musicians today feel very, I looking at this picture of George Harrison and John Lennon on the wall, I mean, there used to be, like, it was very binary. It was like London and New York, UK, US, and that's who was making the music. I think musicians in Senegal and India and Indonesia and the Philippines and Colombia, all over the world, they want to be part of that. They don't want to see that binary line anymore. They are demanding to be part of that circle, and not just demanding it, but they're making it happen. I mean, I was at on a panel over earlier this month in New York, and it was all about world music infiltration in traditional American scenes. And the presenter of Bonnaroo was there, and he's been booking a lot of acts from outside the United States that don't sing in English, that are performing melody lines that aren't the blues, that we don't kind of like hear normally, have time signatures that are really weird, but people are digging it. And he presented Tinariwen, the Malian psychedelic blues band, for lack of better words, the desert blues, and people were packed into the venue. And it's very refreshing to have this kind of acceptance of the present generation, people your age, going to concerts and just enjoying the music because it's connecting with them on some level. Maybe not on a linguistic level, but it's connecting with them. It's no more of this, oh, well, I don't understand what they're saying, or they're not from, my hometown, or they're not from London. Those kind of prejudices, I feel, are just disappearing, and that's very refreshing.
And have you seen this kind of musicianship subvert governments in the past? Or
Well, at the convocation, I played a clip of a story I did on Seun Kuti, the son of Fela Kuti. Now, Fela was notorious for his songs, which name names would really give the government a hard time. The early 70s, he wrote a song called Zombie that so infuriated the government that they sent troops into his house to basically burn it down. His mother was thrown out the window. She was killed. So music does come back to bite people in the butt. Lounes Matoub, a fantastic Berber singer from Algeria, was killed by the Islamic terror group there, the GIS, in the 90s. So musicians in this country, when they sing about a political cause, they do so in incredible comfort and insulation of the First Amendment, of not being threatened. I mean, we have seen where, the East-West rap battles led to deaths, but that wasn't a government coming in and saying, we're going to kill you. That was between artists. But I think artists in this country don't realize what a lot of musicians around the world have to put up with.
Are Americans a hard audience to sell international news to?
Yeah, the United States is a really tough room when it comes to selling the product of international news. It needs to, you need to kind of sugarcoat the pill. It's almost like, vegetables and dessert. This is the vegetable part of the meal. But that's what we're really trying to do, is not turn it into vegetables, but kind of disguise it a little bit, put it on the plate with maybe some strawberry shortcake, make sure there's a little meat on the side, make it attractive to consume. And I think that's partly where our emphasis on storytelling comes in, because it's one thing to have a pundit talk to you about facts and statistics and history, laying out the story. But to have somebody explain their own personal experience of living through the shelling of homes in Syria, to hear their pain and their suffering and what they've lost, family members, that's a completely different way of kind of casting the story. And so I feel if we can get Americans to empathize with those little, oh yeah, I've been in your situation before, maybe not that bad, but I know what it's like to lose a child, I know what it's like to lose a mother. Then the connection starts, and then maybe empathy can grow. But just saying, we're going to have some foreign correspondents on to talk about what's happening in South Sudan, that's not going to get American listeners.
Yeah, and along those same lines, if we're talking about the state of American media, why do you think, or is the United States particularly partisan? Because I saw a video you posted online talking about exactly the same issue, pundits, and kind of cutting through the partisan hackery. Is that something that's unique in America, and if so, why is that?
Well, Congress has gotten incredibly partisan in the last 20 years. I think media tends to follow what's happening in Washington, kind of as a pattern. The other thing that's exploded is just the number of channels on TV and outlets where news can be delivered online. So all these outlets are kind of clamoring for everybody's attention. And in order to grab people's attention, they have to create an identity. And so we know now that Fox is the conservative news channel. We know that MSNBC is the opposite. Somewhere in the middle might be, ABC or CBS or CNN. Everybody's got their position. Everybody's got their style. Fox likes to get people from the opposite point of view Bill O'Reilly likes to take them apart. It's very confrontational. It's very loud and in your face. But basically, all these broadcast journalists are trying to fill airtime, and so I believe a lot of people are just kind of being careless and not kind of like really thinking about the stories they're talking about. There's way too much airtime to burn up. People aren't kind of using it wisely. And so it kind of goes into this kind of echo chamber, and the partisanship gets even worse. So it's, between that and everybody competing for attention, it's kind of an ugly environment right now.
And do you think that's made worse by this idea of the citizen journalist, kind of in a social media age, that everyone can kind of, put the news out there? Because obviously not everyone is Marco Werman, but, it seems to me like a lot of people think that they are experts about an issue because they can write on it. Is that fueling some of this fire, or is that...
I think it is. I don't think I've got, I'm setting the bar for, the standard. But I think it depends on who the citizen journalist is. I mean, I think there are some citizen journalists that are doing a great job, and they're kind of sorting through the facts. But we also have people who, the whole, when the Boston bombing happened last year, and, the speculation that just went kind of like wildfire on Reddit about who that initial suspect might have been, like ruined a guy's life. And that's just some people who are kind of like doing their own kind of private freelance gumshoe work based on tweets, based on things that were said on CNN, based on what other people are kind of like throwing into the hat on places like Reddit. And it's, and so it's easy to get the story wrong. On the other hand, like the last kind of 3 breaking stories that I was curious about in Boston, I found out about on Twitter. The Boston bombing, we were about to go to air, and some guy I know who was near the finish line tweeted at 10 of, like seconds after it happened, bombs going off at the marathon. There was a car accident where a kid was killed, and the way I found out about it was I typed in the #intersection or neighborhood on Twitter, and immediately somebody had reported via the Boston Police Department that a kid had been hit. And then there was an earthquake. None of the public radio stations, none of the local radio stations on AM in Boston had this news, but I was sitting up in my daughter's bedroom with her, and the whole house shook. Like, what's going on? Is somebody bowling downstairs? But nobody had the news, and so I went to Twitter and I got the news that way. So, these are all kind of great tools and great kind of technological gifts, but they need to be used the right way. So some citizen journalists have done a great job. Seth Mnookin, who has done journalism before, so he's in it, but he's teaching journalism media studies at MIT. But he became very much a citizen journalist during the whole Boston bombing thing. A lot of people were downloading these police scanners to their iPhones. They knew where things were happening, and he just followed the story. And he was really accurate. He treated the facts and weighed them out before kind of pushing anything out. So it really depends.
I'd like to turn for a second to the earlier part of your career.
Yeah.
Because you have you've said that you started your first job in journalism at age 16.
Right.
And
yeah.
I'm wondering, what is it that initially drew you to journalism? And is this something, journalism, radio, is that something that you always knew that you wanted to be involved in?
No, I didn't know that. Radio kind of happened because I was freelancing and I needed some more outlets to survive. But I grew up without a TV. I spent a lot of time listening to radio. I spent a lot of time listening to records that were spoken word. So the actual kind of culture and aesthetic of putting audio together to tell a story, it wasn't a tough learn for me. It came to me pretty quickly. But even before that, I guess when I was 9 or 10, we had a very close, not blood family, but kind of a family friend, godfather to me, who worked for ABC News. And I visited his office when I was pretty young. And he had done documentaries, which we kind of watched on the old Steenbeck editing decks, on a day in the life of a soldier in Vietnam. This was in the 60s. He had done a documentary on the Vienna Choir Boys. And I was just absolutely seduced by the notion that as a journalist you can go into somebody's home at least knock on their door and ask them if you can talk with them. Why? Because I'm a journalist. You know, you don't have to talk to me, but I'd really like to talk to you. And I just thought that was incredibly powerful. It was incredibly cool. It had the ability to transform people's lives potentially. And then, and then I saw All the President's Men, about how 2 journalists from the Washington Post were able to take down the Nixon presidency, and I just thought, this is what I want to do. One of the old jobs back in the old days was copy boy. If it was local news, you'd take it to the local editor. If it was national news, etc. And so I did that when I was in high school. I'd leave school and I'd show up at work at 4 and work the shift until 11 when the first edition came out. And it was, I loved being in that newsroom. I was only 16, but I was filled with like smart aleck journalists who talked politics, they talked movies, they talked music, culture, a lot of joking around. It was a way, there's a lot of dark humor, a way of dealing with this kind of troubled world we lived in. I just felt really at home, and, it didn't help. It didn't hurt either back then that you had this kind of like smell of ink and newsprint. It was like an industrial occupation. A lot of that has changed, but I still love coming to work every day and coming into the newsroom. It's just like that's where the action is, and So I knew from a pretty young age that's what I wanted to do. But it wasn't until I was freelancing in print in West Africa that I realized I got to get a few more strings here. So I tried the BBC, and they said, yeah, we need somebody in Ouagadougou. So I started writing dispatches on telex machines, which would then be sent to London, and they would read them there. The phone lines to West Africa were so crummy at the time that they wouldn't have heard me. It was just like... and then I, slowly taught myself how to make a reporter package, and then I was kind of off and running, and then I just stayed in radio.
So a lot of commentators have, in the popular press, have kind of bemoaned what they see as America's eroding credibility internationally. Is this an issue that you see? I know you travel a lot. Is this something that you see when you go out into the world? Do you see people talking about America, wondering about America, and questioning its role in the world? Or
Totally. The last big trip I took overseas was to London in 2012. So it's been a while. That's one of the problems with anchoring a show. You are anchored to the studio. But we went to London, me and a producer, Alex Gallifant, to basically find out on the eve of the U.S. presidential election in November of 2012, outside attitudes of the United States. So we considered London this kind of emblematic city. It was impossible to go to every continent and find out what do people think. So we looked at London as kind of this quintessential cosmopolitan city. People from all over the world come there, and let's just look at the U.S. reputation, U.S. credibility today on the eve of this big election between Obama and Romney. And I don't know if you recall, but people were, aside from Nate Silver, people were pretty, it's going to be so close. Romney could win this one. Or, no, Obama's going to win, don't worry. And, people in Europe were worried. People love Obama there. Although the luster was starting to wear off a little bit. People were wondering, why hasn't he closed Guantanamo? He said he was going to do that. Why hasn't the United States, under Obama, taken more of a leadership role on climate change? They were upset about that. And just generally, kind of, where is the United States headed? I think a lot of people are kind of confused about, it's not just the United States, but there is no kind of overwhelming, like, organizational thing, like the Cold War, that while it wasn't really good, we knew where things stood. We don't really know where things stand in the world right now. The Arab world is going through incredible changes. The White House initially seemed pretty stoked about that, but now Syria's version of the Arab Spring is just a massive tragedy, humanitarian and otherwise. So it's a really confusing time. But one of the reasons I feel very strongly that those stories about the world need to be told, because quite often we hear a lot about ourselves. We learn a lot about ourselves from other people in other countries. And it's easy to not look at the news and just think the United States is a great place. We're the best, we're the richest, we're on top of the world. All of that is true, but you have to also understand that you can't have that responsibility and that role and that position and just pretend like the rest of the world doesn't exist. Otherwise, it's the Hunger Games. We're living in the capital, and everybody else is out in the districts, and eventually, that's not sustainable. Everything that rises must fall.
And along those lines, if you were a policymaker, how would you be trying to redefine how America engages with the world? Not to be an international bully, but at the same time to be involved and engaged with other countries, on the international stage. How would you go about kind of plotting America's course?
I think about this all the time, and then it's like, man, I've got some really good ideas. Maybe I should run for office. No, it's like Wyclef Jean's, song. What was the song? If I were president, I'd be elected on Friday and assassinated on Saturday. I would say, the big problem we have right now is that progressives want a huge kind of list of demands. Conservatives say, no, you're wrong. We've got to get government out of people's lives. I actually think, between global warming is really, to me, just the big issue that we need to address. And it's not just about dialing back carbon emissions. It's about redefining the entire world economy, because it's about producing food, which is an incredible generator of carbon. The shipping of all this globalized trade is an incredible, massive use of carbon. The manufacturing of all those products, the digging up of fossil fuels. They want to dig up, the tar sands in Alberta. There's fracking happening now at an even greater pace. And the reason we need all this energy is because we've got huge box stores, and it's not just here. There are box stores all over the world now, and they're just constantly being filled up with stuff, more stuff. That's also not sustainable. So there needs to be some massive grand bargain at a global level. I don't know if the United Nations would do it or if the U.S. would take the lead, but somebody in a position of power like the United States does need to take the lead, and there needs to be a massive redefinition of what we can sustainably continue to do on this planet.
So I've heard a lot recently about concerns with journalism.
Yeah.
That the industry is going under, that it's changing, that it's no longer in any way profitable. Where do you think journalism is going in the future, and how can people of our generation, our aspiring journalists, work to make sure that quality journalism is preserved?
It's such a confusing and rapidly shifting kind of industry. I'm reluctant to kind of say this is where it's headed, but I still believe that if you go back to the early kind of, if we go back just to the 19th century, like Charles Dickens wanted to be a novelist, but he ended up writing for a newspaper. But in his spare time, he would write these novels, these great novels, and some of them were even serialized. Edgar Allan Poe also worked for a newspaper. I think, the best journalists today, whether they are kind of cranking out these human interest stories or whether they are investigative journalists, it always comes back to the story and remembering that somebody picks up a paper, they're basically asking a number of reporters a question that everybody, or a favor that a lot of people around the world ask, and that is, tell me a story. And we all want to be entertained, informed, provoked. So I still think it's all about the story. If we're just pandering to celebrity culture and clickbait, then journalism will go under, because that's not going to inform the public, and the public won't get wiser and they won't get educated about what's going on in the world. But there are tricks we can use, and the oldest trick in the book is just telling a story.